And I went to church, the 6th Ward, which used to be down on the building down on South 4th. It's now gone. And it was Fast Sunday. We came out of church on the steps. They had a lot of steps in the old 6th Ward. We came out of church and somebody from across the street come running over and said that Pearl Harbor had been attacked, that we were at war. And that was the first time as we walked out of the church, they tell us that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And of course, it wasn't exactly unexpected that something, I mean, after all, they'd been in war in Europe for some time, and we had avoided getting in there into the war. But that's when I first heard about it.
So Mom, when did you hear about about the bombing of Pearl Harbor?
Well, I was really young. Mother and Dad had got on a trip with one of the people that Daddy worked with, and they were on their way up to Seattle or someplace. And in those days, they didn't always have radios in the car, and so they didn't know. And then all of a sudden, Mother wrote about this. She says, all of a sudden, all of these military equipment was passing them, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong. And that was when they got to Spokane or wherever it was they were going, Seattle. They found out that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor.
Now, see, you had only been 12 years old.
Yeah.
So you should remember it.
Well, yeah, but
12 years
we
old.
didn't have
No.
we didn't have radios in the car. We didn't have
no internet.
Yeah, it was in the dark ages as far as that was concerned.
So then when did you go into the Army?
Immediately after Pearl Harbor, I was called up. We'd already signed up, possibly to be called. So I was called up immediately, and went before you had to go before the board and before the officer be examined. And I went through the line. Doctors were there, and we went through the line, and they checked us all over, had us jump up and down, check the heart. And they put me in class 4F. Said, you will never be called. You've got some heart problems. You will never be called. Of course, I knew I had heart problems from birth. I was born about 6 weeks premature, weighed 4 pounds, and had these heart problems from birth. And so I'd had a kind of a rough childhood, hadn't been able to participate in sports or anything like that because of the heart. And that added further problems because the doctor, when I reached the 7th grade, the doctor said, well, I want you to take physical education. Now here I was a boy that had never thrown a ball, batted a ball, been in sports of any kind. So the coach had called the roll, sent us out in the field. And of course the boys all made fun of me because I was so comical to look at, and I'm sure I was. Tried to throw a ball, tried to catch the ball, and of course they called me a sissy and laughed at me. And it was extremely difficult to stay in school. And finally, after completing the first half of the 7th grade, the doctor said, well, I think you better take this boy out of school because he's got, and by then it was really emotional problems, a lot of them. And so then getting back to 1940, after I had worked at the putting in window displays for about a year, I left that and the government at that time offered a course, national defense course in radio, and I took that. It was held up at the university here, and I took that course. But they, as I say, they turned me down. But they said you would be called back in 6 months by some other doctors, Army doctors, and so, but you won't have to worry about it. So about 6 weeks before I was called in, I tried to volunteer in the Signal Corps. I thought I would like to be in the Signal Corps. And they turned me down again, the doctor did. 6 weeks later, I went through, the doctors examined me again. And by that time, I guess they decided, well, if you could crawl across the room, why, you were all right. And they said, well, you're in the Army. Just like that. And of course, it was hard for me because I had never been away from home over maybe a week with relatives. And I was sent to Fort Douglas down in Salt Lake. And at Fort Douglas in Salt Lake, they gave a battery of tests, general classification tests, to determine what branch you'd go in. Now in the infantry, of course, you didn't have to have, it was a lower score was all that was needed with the infantry. But in the Air Force, and at that time it was called the Air Corps, but the score was higher that you had to have. And so I was put in the Air Corps after taking a few tests in Salt Lake and at Fort Douglas. They issued our Army clothes and everything, and we shipped off. We arrived at Shepherd Field, Texas, Wichita Falls, July 4th in 1942, I guess that would have been, wouldn't it? And that was for basic training. So we went through basic training there. It was to be, I think, 12 weeks, if I remember, basic training, and I went through that. Now, do you want me to continue from there, or do you just want any more questions?
We don't know what to ask, so.
Anyway, I was in Shepherd Field, Texas, and it was rough. We got into Shepherd Field, as I said, July 4th, and it was 110 in the shade, and there wasn't any shade. And so, within 2 weeks, I was in the hospital. And of course, they said, well, you know, I was concerned that I just wanted to get out of serving. I said, no, that's not my plan at all. But anyway, I was overcome by that. It was so hot, and my heart was bothering me. So then I got out of the hospital, and Army hospital, and went another 2 or 3 weeks. And then they decided, well, it was such hot weather that it's hot down here, so what we're going to do, we're going to take your squadron, one I was in, and we're going to have an experiment. We're going to issue you shirt and shorts, short sleeve shirts, and let you drill, very foolishly. So we went out drilling, and at the end of one day, I was baked. The back of my legs had big
sunburn probably.
oh, I was just burned crisp. Then up here, and they all swelled up. The next day, I was to go on duty at KP, Kitchen Police, they called her. Anyway, I had pots and pans, great big ones. Well, I bent over and I couldn't, you know, these just, oh. And they sent me on sick call. And then they sent me back, said, oh, you can go back to duty. When I got back to duty, the officer said, well, you can't be back in duty. Just go right up to the hospital and tell them I sent you. So I went to the hospital. So I was in the hospital recovering from that for a couple of weeks. So anyway, when I got to about in first part of September, right close to the 1st of September, they sent us to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, to radio operator mechanic school, it was called. And in Sioux Falls, it got down to 40 below, and we lived in these buildings that were covered with wallboard and tar paper, and had 3-pot bellied stoves to heat them. And it was so cold there, it got down, never got up to 0 for weeks, but it was 40 below part of that time. And so but while I was in Sioux Falls, I thought there's only one way I can physically get through this war. I must become an officer. Now, as an officer in the infantry, you're pretty expendable. But an officer in the Air Corps was different. But they said, well, you need 2 years of college, which I didn't have. So anyway, but later on they come out and they said, well, we need communications officers. So we'll take the highest 10% of the class and interview them and then pick officer to go to officer school. So the class was about 500, and so it was about 50 of us were called in. And out of that 50, about 14 or 15 were accepted. And I so happened I was, I think, number 11 in the class. And I'd worked real hard to get my grades up. I thought, oh, this is one thing I better do, because if I'm an enlisted man, I won't last any time at all out in the field someplace. So I got my grades up, and I took, we took radio theory for half of the day, about half of the day. Then we took Morse code for the other half. Well, you only needed about 6 to 10 words a minute in Morse code to be put in a bomber. But I got my code up to 30 words a minute. And that actually brought my grade way up. So I was accepted to officer school. Then I didn't think I'd ever get through officer school, for the simple reason I couldn't do any of the physical things. I couldn't swim. We went back to Pennsylvania for 6 weeks. We were near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. And then we went, they said we were cadets. Then we went up to New Haven, Connecticut, to Yale for the next 6 weeks. And they did these physical tests, supposedly because you were becoming an officer. And they took us, I couldn't swim, so they took us up to the ones that couldn't swim, which weren't too many. They took us up to I think it was this 8th or 9th floor of this big fancy building at Yale University, and it had a pool, swimming pool, it was over your head everywhere in it. And they said, the sergeant says, all right, now jump in that pool. I said, you've got to be crazy. I said, I can't swim. Oh, you'll swim if you jump in. That was his way of teaching you how to swim. I said, well, I won't do it. So then they gave us tests, a number of physical tests. One was called the Brewer test, and it had a step, and you stepped up 1, 2, 3, then 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, and they'd beat time like this, and you'd have to keep up with it all. I did that till I couldn't make another step, and so I didn't think I'd ever get through the physical things that they required of you. But finally, I got commissioned as an officer, 2nd lieutenant. And my first assignment was at Gowan Field. When we got our commission, there were openings all over the country at air bases. And I looked and saw Gowan Field at Boise, and I'd been away from home for nearly a year. And I thought, well, this is my chance to visit home before I get sent overseas. So I better take it. So I picked Mountain Home, or rather Gowan Field. And then I was there for a month or so, and came back to, I got leave. My brother Bill had an emergency appendectomy, And I came back to Pocatello because he was at home, and we spent a week at home. Then later, about a month later, they said they had an opening in Pocatello, would I like to be transferred. So I was stationed at Pocatello Air Base for a while. And then the whole unit was moved to Mountain Home Air Base, which had been opened. It was really a rough place to be. It was so sandy over there. So I went there. They were getting ready to go to the Pacific, and I wasn't too excited about going to the Pacific. I thought, I want to go to Europe. I'd rather go to England. And so I asked for a transfer. They tried to talk me out of it. And I might say, while I was at Gowan Field, Jimmy Stewart was the operations officer. Jimmy Stewart, the movie star, was the operations officer in the unit I was with. And another interesting thing, when I was at Yale, we'd go to this big mess hall, they called it, an eating place, dining. And every lunch, Glenn Miller and music was up on a big balcony and played their music for us. So anyway, after I asked for a transfer out of the unit I was with, it was an aerodrome squadron, and they sent me right to Wendover. And I got to Wendover, and they says, well, you're on your way overseas. That was just a staging ground. So they put us on a train, and troop train, and we went to the East Coast, back to Boston, at Camp Miles Standish, and waited to be shipped out.
So when did you meet Mom? Was it before you went overseas, or just later? No, it was later.
So then we sailed out of Boston in December. I can't remember the exact date. And of course, it was a rough ride across the North Atlantic in the wintertime. And the ship was kind of going like this, and at the same time going like this.
And did you have to zigzag?
Yes, they took 9 days. Everybody hoped what they called the Queen ships were also in use then, and everybody hoped they could get on a Queen ship because it took about 4 or 5 days, but ours took 9 days because that's what they were doing. And you couldn't go any faster than the slowest ship, and the one I was on wasn't very big. I think it was a 7,000 ton rather. It wasn't a very big ship, and sometimes we couldn't sit at the table and eat dinner. The food would be sliding all over the place. So it was interesting going across, and each officer had to serve. We had it good because we were in staterooms. The officers got to have staterooms up with the ship's officers. But the enlisted men, poor enlisted men, were down on what they called the hold down on the ship. The bunks were stacked up high, and they'd get so sick. Everybody on there got so sick. And, I always remember this one older man. He was an older fellow, quite a bit older than me. I served as officer of the day down one day while crossing, and you had to go down there and be with the enlisted men. And they'd come through, officers would come through and inspect. And this man, he said, "Oh, Lieutenant McCurdy," he says, "I'm so sick. I can't go out. I'm so sick." I said, "Well, you go to the furthest back corner of the ship here. Get on the highest bunk you can find and cover up and keep still," which he did. And he said, "I just can't go out." So then when we got to England, we embarked up in Scotland and then took a train down into England. So that was how my career started. Any other questions?
So then you were stationed in London for how long?
Well,
you never went.
I was first I was stationed I spent that Christmas at a little town called Trowbridge. Then I was sent. Oh, by the way, when we got over there, they said, well, we don't need communications officers. How come they send all of you communications officers over here? So you'll have to give you jobs doing something else. So I was sent to what was called a base air depot outside of Salisbury, England. Salisbury is where the real beautiful cathedral is. And we were stationed out in a little town out of there called Denton. And it was a base air depot. It was where they were assembling all this equipment for the war, for the invasion. And so I was stationed there. And it was while I was there that the invasion started. And for 6 weeks prior to the invasion, they didn't let any mail get shipped out, sent out, because they didn't want anything leaked. And you couldn't go down to the coast during that time period. But we knew the invasion had started because that night, the early evening, we started seeing these planes taking these gliders over, pulling gliders over. So we knew the invasion had started. So then I was there for some time, and then I went to, I did a number of things. I was a courier, secret courier. You'd take secret messages. I did nothing but censor mail for about 6 weeks. That was interesting to read people's mail. But everything had to be censored. The officers had to censor all the mail. An officer could censor his own mail, and they were spot checked. But the enlisted men, somebody had to
every day.
Check.
Every letter.
Yes. Every letter went out. So then, later on, I got transferred. Finally, I wanted a job in communications, so I had the use of a Jeep. And the enlisted man, officers never drove, and so I had the use of a Jeep and an enlisted man. And a friend of mine said, why don't we go into London and see if we can get a job with the Air Transport Command? So we went into London, took the Jeep, went into London, asked to talk to personnel, told him we wanted a job in communications. He says, I'll get you transferred. So that's when I went to work for Air Transport Command. And Air Transport Command was like a airline for the military.
It's 3 o'clock.
They hauled equipment and they hauled passengers at times, and so that's we had flights going down into Italy and North Africa. We had flights even going into neutral countries. And if you got a job in a neutral country, why you put civilian clothes on, and went in there, and you might be sitting at dinner with the Germans. Or Italian or whatever. So that's how come I went down to see. Then I went down to see my brother Bill. I knew Bill was in Italy and close to Naples. We had flights going into Naples. So when I could first get away, I went down there. And to see Bill, I called over there and told him I wanted to talk with my brother. He says, your brother's not here. I said, well, you tell him, that was in the afternoon, you tell him that his brother from England is here and I want to talk to him on the phone tonight. About 8:30 I'll call back. So about 8:30 I called back and got what they call an orderly, and told him again I wanted to talk to my brother, Sergeant McCurdy. And he says, well, he's not here. So I said, well, where is he? And there was this long blank. And he says, well he's MIA. And at that time, I didn't quite hit me what it meant. And Ray Condé, who was the pilot I flew down with, was from Preston, Idaho. I looked at Ray, and Ray was standing there. I looked at Ray. I said, Ray, what's MIA? As soon as I asked the question, he didn't answer. It hit me, missing in action. I said, well, how long has he been missing? He says, 10 days. And so he says, I can't tell you anymore. But I said, well, if I come over there, can you tell me more? And he said, yes. So that's when I think I related last night. I went over, finally got there. First I went out to Naples to get on the plane. The operations officer said, oh, you don't need orders. They usually have orders for everything. You don't need orders for that. And just tell him, I said, you would fly. I got out there and the pilot wouldn't take me. He said, have any orders? And I said, no. He said, well, you're not going to go in my plane. And even though I told him what I was there for, so I went back in and the operations officer says, I'll send a training plane over with you this afternoon. Well, it started in, since this was late November, it started in and it just snowed and snowed and snowed. So I didn't have anybody to replace me back in Cornwall, so I couldn't be gone very long. So I thought, well, I better go back to fly back. So I went back the next day to Cornwall. And then it was a month later that I came down and went over to Focia, where Bill was stationed, and of course found out the details of his. Bill was flying. He was sort of the engineer and a gunner on a B-17, and he made a lot of missions into Germany and into Austria, and he was on his 49th mission. They had to complete 50 to come back to the States. He was on his 49th, and as they completed their mission, they started back, and the plane developed engine trouble, and it was vibrating real bad and sputtering oil all over, and the pilot gave the orders to bail out. 7 bailed out, and Bill was one of the 7 that bailed out. And because when I got over to Focia, why they said, well, the pilot and co-pilot radio operator made it back on that. And after he had ordered them to bail out, why, they did get the plane under control. They crash landed it in northern Italy. And they didn't know what happened. I said, did Bill, my brother, did he bail out one of the first or one of the last? He said, no, in between. And out of the 7 that bailed out, 6 were picked up and put in a prison camp. And eventually contacted my mother. And they didn't know what happened to Bill. And that was in 1944, December 16th, 1944, or November, rather, it was in November 16th, 1944, that Bill went down.
So had somebody, didn't you say that they took everything that Bill would have left in where his bed was, or that he left things and it wasn't there when you got there?
No, by the time I got there, they'd taken them all. He had a diary. He kept a diary all the time, and we never did get the diary. He'd taken lots of pictures, and we finally got the camera. They sent the camera, but the pictures never did show up. Somebody got there and got all these. We don't know where it ever went. So that was my time up until that. Then I was with the Air Transport Command back in Cornwall. And I was there until from September about till around Christmas time. And I was sent to, then's when I went back to London and was stationed at London.
And did you stay with your cousin? Wasn't one of your cousins around London?
Oh,
or?
that's when I was in, no, that was in, well, yes, George Dawson. But I went to church in Salisbury. We had a servicemen's meeting, and I went to church in Salisbury one Sunday, and that's where I met George Dawson, my cousin.
That's your cousin.
Boise, he was a musician. George was a musician. So yeah, neither one of us knew the other was in England at the time. And so yes, then we did get together a time or two or a number of times over in London. When I first got to London, it was such a huge city. And I'd grown up in Pocatello, which wasn't very huge. And the first thing I asked, I said, well, I don't know whether I want to be here or not in London. I'd like a transfer somewhere else. And the officer says, well, why don't you stay for a month? If you don't like it, we'll transfer you someplace else. Well, I stayed there a month, and I kind of liked it because it was lots of things going on in London. Of course, it was all black. It was a blackout everywhere. But there was theaters, there was movie houses and they sent all the movies direct over to the troops. We saw movies. It took a couple of years after I got back for the movies to catch up, even back then. And then there was, George and I went to the symphony. We went to plays. There was a Shakespeare play, King Lear. I remember going to that. And a lot of stuff to do in London. Then they had that's where the mission home was. It was called 149 Nightingale Lane. I can still remember the street, called Ravensley. It was a big old mansion that they had taken over for the church, and that's where they had the church meeting. So I stayed there till in London, and I was there. I was what was called a radio briefing officer. And I was there till the war ended in Europe. And then it ended a little bit later in Asia. And by the time I was transferred, at the very end there to, our whole unit went to Paris. So I was in Paris for just a while. But I had requested a transfer in what was called Army Airways Communication System. And it came through after I got to Paris. So then they sent me back to London. And when I got back to London, why they said, well, you have enough points to go home, back to the States. And if you want to choose that. And I kind of wanted to go into Germany with the occupation, but in the meantime, Mother was having such a terrible time with having Bill missing that I thought, oh, I better go back to the States. So I came back to the States in late 1945, and it was then they says so many were returning that they were flooded with trying to handle that many. So they said, we'll give you 45 days temporary duty at home. It won't count against your leave time. It's just temporary duty at home. So you can go home. So I come home, and I think it was October of 1945. And that's when I was saying that Mother, when I got to, we came in, and I think it was Hampton Roads, Virginia, the ship docked, and I called home immediately, and Mother says, oh, I told Dad that we were going to hear from you today. She said, Dad said, oh, Mother, you must be imagining. No, it came to me. We're going to hear from Dean today, and it was about noon. Pocatello time when I called. And she said the reason she was quite concerned that because I missed one troop ship coming back to the States, and I didn't write because I knew I was coming back, and so she hadn't got any mail from me for about 6 weeks, and so she was quite concerned. So that was when that 45 days was when I went to church, and that's when they had most of those people that were in that picture, the choir, and your mother was in that choir at that time. Of course, she would have only been, 16 then? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I went to a fireside one night down on 2nd Avenue here to People's Place, and then I asked her if she would take her home afterwards, which I did. So we had a date or two. That was 1945. Then I had
to go back.
Then and after Christmas, I had to return. I went down to Hill Field, and they sent me up to Spokane Army Air Base, and then from there I went to. Finally, I ended up at McClellan Field in California, and that's where I was released from the service. It was in McClellan Field.
So was the war over with?
Yes,
You were released?
yes, it was over. So anyway, that was my time in the service.
So, Mom, tell about moving to Pocatello.
I can't remember that much out of it. My memory is kind of gone.
Okay, but
What you came down to Helen, and you said you came with Helen down?
Yeah.
Your dad had moved down here to build the shop.
Yeah,
and it seemed like your mom didn't like Pocatello. She thought it was a dirty town because of the railroad and everything.
It was, because you couldn't go downtown, and when you got through walking on the streets, there was your ankle socks would be filthy when you got home, just walking down the street.
Because of the soot and everything from the trains.
Yeah, from the trains. And yeah. Anyway,
So you started at Pocatello High School?
Yeah, I went to, I guess I was in the 9th grade. Yeah, because
Probably.
Yeah, it was. I was in the 9th grade.
And then you were something at the high school, like the treasurer or something?
Yes, because Mr. Zebarth, that was in charge of the school bank, and I was in one of his classes, and he says, you need to come and let me put you in the school bank, and we'd sell the what did they call them? Activity tickets and things like that. And when we'd go to the bank, they had a night deposit, and we'd get to have a policeman take us down and put the money in the bank, and then the downtown bank, and then the next day they'd send a policeman with us to get the things.
The receipt or whatever?
Yeah, yeah. So that we would be safe getting back to school. And I really liked. I had never really liked school very much when I was younger, but I sure liked high school. We Dean and I got married when? December 22nd or something like that.
Yep.
1946.
1946. And you didn't graduate until spring of 1947.
So how did you feel when you heard about the atomic bomb or the end of the war?
Well, we didn't. They didn't say much about it. I mean, that was a real secret, and so there was hardly anything ever in the paper about what happened or anything.
Because it was a secret when it was getting built.
Yeah.
Pardon?
It was a secret.
Yeah.
They made the atomic bomb.
Oh, yes, that was a secret. Yeah, that ended the war and made. Of course, the war in Europe. I think it was in August, if I remember. That year, or 1945, was it?
Mm-hmm.
That the war ended there. But then when they dropped the bomb, yeah, finished it off over in Europe or in Asia.
What did you want to ask?
Ask Grandma. What was it like being on the home front? Were you affected by rationing?
Yes.
What did you have? How was
Yeah.
it like? What did you have to do without?
We had little booklets that they would give us, and when you'd go to the store, you had to tear out a coupon if you were getting certain things, but other things didn't have rationing, and you could get all you wanted of that. And I can remember Mother, when she knew rationing was coming on, she canned everything that we had she had it in bottles, and when you do that, some of those things, after so long, when they're in bottles, they explode. and I can remember Mother sent us down into where we were keeping this, and the things and they had exploded, and we had to wash all the bottles, and that was a mess. But we were glad that Mother had done that, because we had a little bit of choice of what we could buy to eat.
Anything else you want to know?
No.
You've heard it all. All right.